The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. Read by Valerie Windsor.
You know, my dears, that your mother was an orphan, an only child, and I dare say you have heard that your grandfather was a clergyman up in Westmoreland. I was just a girl in the village school when, one day, your grandmother came in to ask if there was any scholar there who would do for a nursemaid. And mighty proud I was when the mistress called me up and spoke to my being a good girl at my needle, and a steady, honest girl, and one whose parents were very respectable, though they might be poor. I thought I should like nothing better than to serve the young lady, who was blushing as deep as I was as she spoke of the coming baby. So I was engaged as nursemaid, and settled at the parsonage before Miss Rosamond, that was the baby who is now your mother, was born. There never was such a baby before or since, though you've all of you been fine enough in your turns. But for sweet winning ways you've none of you come up to your mother. She took after her mother, who was a real lady born, a Miss Furnivall, a granddaughter of Lord Furnivall's in Northumberland. When your mother, little Miss Rosamond, was about 4 or 5 years old, both her parents died in a fortnight, one after the other. Oh, that was a sad time. My mistress asked me on her deathbed never to leave Miss Rosamond, but if she had never spoken a word, I would have gone with that little child to the end of the world. Well, the next thing, the executors came to settle the affairs, and it was decided that Miss Rosamond and me were to go to Furnivall Manor House in Northumberland, for my Lord Furnivall spoke as if it were my mistress's dying wish that Miss Rosamond should live with his family, and as if he had no objections, for that 1 or 2 more or less could make no difference in so grand a household. I was well pleased that all the folks in the Dale should stare and admire when they heard I was going to be the young lady's maid at my Lord Furnivall's. But I had made a mistake in thinking we were to go and live where my lord did. It turned out that the family had left Furnivall Manor House 50 years or more, and that now only an old Miss Furnivall, a great-aunt of my lord's, lived there with just a few servants. My lord thought it would suit Miss Rosamond very well for a few years, and that her being there might perhaps amuse his old aunt. I was bidden by my lord to have Miss Rosamond's things ready by a certain day. He was a stern, proud man, as they say all the Lords Furnivall were, and he never spoke a word more than was necessary. Folk did say he had loved my young mistress, but because she knew that his father would object, she would never listen to him, and married Mr. Esthwaite. But I don't know. He never married at any rate, but he never took much notice of Miss Rosamond, which I think he might have done if he had cared for a dead mother. He sent his gentleman, Master Henry, with us to the manor house, telling him to join him at Newcastle that same evening, so that there was no great length of time for him to make us known to all the strangers, before he too shook us off, and we were left, 2 lonely young things, I was not 18, in the great old manor house. It seems like yesterday that we drove there. We left our own dear parsonage very early, and we both cried as if our hearts would break. And now it was long past noon on a September day, and we stopped to change horses for the last time at a smoky town all full of colliers and miners. Miss Rosamond had fallen asleep, but Master Henry told me to waken her, that she might see the park and the manor house as we drove up. I thought it rather a pity, but I did what he bade me, for fear he should complain of me to my lord. We had left all signs of a town or even a village, and were then inside the gates of a large, wild park, not like the parks here, but with rocks and the noise of running water, and gnarled thorn trees and old oaks, all white and peeled with age. The road went up about 2 miles, and then we saw a great and stately house, with many trees close around it, so close that in some places their branches dragged against the walls when the wind blew, and some hung broken down, for no one seemed to take much charge of the place, to lop the wood or to keep the moss-covered carriageway in order. Only in front of the house all was clear. The great oval drive was without weed. The house, though it was so desolate, was even grander than I had expected. Behind it, unenclosed and bare, rose the fells. When we drove up to the great front entrance and went into the hall, I thought we should be lost. It was so large and vast and grand. There was a chandelier all of bronze hung down from the ceiling, and I had never seen one before, and looked at it all in amaze. At one end of the hall was a great fireplace as large as the sides of the houses in my country. At the opposite end, to the left as you went in on the western side, was an organ built into the wall, and so large it filled up the best part of that end. On each side of the fireplace were doors leading to the east front, but those I never went through, so I can't tell you what lay beyond. The afternoon was closing in, and the hall, which had no fire lighted in it, looked dark and gloomy. But we did not stay there a moment. The servant who had opened the door for us led us into the west drawing-room, where he said that Miss Furnivall was sitting. Poor little Miss Rosamond held very tight to me, as if she was scared and lost. And as for myself, I was not much better. The west drawing-room was very cheerful-looking, with a warm fire in it and plenty of good, comfortable furniture about. Miss Furnivall was an old lady, not far from 80, I should think. She was thin and tall, and had a face full of fine wrinkles. Her eyes were very watchful, to make up, I suppose, for her being so deaf as to be obliged to use a trumpet. Sitting with her, working at the same piece of tapestry, was Mrs. Stark, her maid and companion, and almost as old as she was. She had lived with Miss Furnivall ever since they were both young, and now she seemed more like a friend than a servant. She looked so cold and grey and stony, as if she had never loved or cared for anyone, and I don't suppose she did care for anyone except her mistress. And owing to the great deafness of the latter, Mrs. Stark treated her very much as if she were a child. Master Henry gave some message from my lord, and then bowed good-bye to us all, taking no notice of my sweet little Miss Rosamond's outstretched hand, and left us standing there, being looked at by the two old ladies through their spectacles. I was right glad when they rang for the old footman who had shown us in at first, and told him to take us to our rooms, which I was not sorry to hear were just over the kitchens, but I began to think I should be lost in that wilderness of a house. There was an old nursery with a pleasant fire burning in the grate, and the kettle boiling on the hob, and out of that room was the night nursery with a little crib for Miss Rosamond close to my bed. And old James, the footman, called up Dorothy, his wife, to bid us welcome, and both he and she were so hospitable and kind that I would never wish to meet with kinder people. They had one servant under them to do all the rough work, Bessie they called her, and she and me and James and Dorothy, with Miss Furnivall and Mrs. Stark, made up the family, always remembering, of course, my sweet little Miss Rosamond. I used to wonder what they had done before she came, they thought so much of her now. Kitchen and drawing-room, it was all the same. The hard, sad Miss Furnivall and the cold Mrs. Stark looked pleased when she came fluttering in like a bird, and I'm sure they were sorry many a time when she flitted away into the kitchen, though they were too proud to ask her to stay with them. The great old rambling house was a famous place for little Miss Rosamond. She made expeditions all over it, with me at her heels, all except the east wing, which was never opened, and whither we never thought of going. But in the western and northern parts were many things that were curiosities to us. The windows were darkened by the sweeping boughs of trees, and the ivy which had overgrown them, but even in the green gloom we could manage to see old china jars and carved ivory boxes, and above all the old pictures. Once, I remember, my darling would have Dorothy go with us and tell us who they all were, for they were portraits of some of my lord's family. In the state drawing-room over the hall there was a picture of Miss Furnivall, or as she was called in those days, Miss Grace, for she was the younger sister. Such a beauty she must have been, but with such a set, proud look, and such scorn looking out of her handsome eyes, with her eyebrows raised as if she were wondering how anyone could have the impertinence to look at her, and her lips curled at us as we stood there gazing. She had a dress on the like of which I had never seen before, but it was all the fashion when she was young, a gown of blue satin open at the front to a quilted white stomacher. "Well, to be sure," said I, "who would have thought that Miss Furnivall had been such an out-and-out beauty to see her now?" "Yes," said Dorothy, "but if what my master's father used to say was true, Miss Furnivall, the elder sister, was handsomer than Miss Grace. Her picture is here somewhere, but if I show it to you, you must never let on that you have seen it. Can the little lady hold her tongue?" Well, I was not so sure, for she was such an outspoken child, so I set her to hide herself, and then I helped Dorothy to turn a great picture that leaned with its face against the wall, and was not hung up like the others were. To be sure, it beat Miss Grace for beauty, and I think for scornful pride too, though in that matter it might be hard to choose. I could have looked at it for an hour, but Dorothy seemed half frightened at having shown it to me, and hurried it back again and bade me run and find Miss Rosamond, for there were some ugly places about the house where she would ill like for the child to be. Well, I was a brave, high-spirited girl, and thought little of what she said, for I liked hide-and-seek as well as any child in the parish. As winter drew on, and the days grew shorter, I was sometimes almost certain that I heard a noise, as if someone was playing on the great organ in the hall. The first night I asked Dorothy who had been playing music, and James said very shortly that I was a gawk to take the wind soughing in the trees for music. But I saw Dorothy look at him very fearfully, and Bessie, the kitchen maid, went quite white. I saw they did not like my question, so I held my peace until I was with Dorothy alone, for I knew it was the organ and not the wind. But never a word could I get from her. So then I tried Bessie. She said I must never, never tell, and if I ever told, I was never to say she had told me. But she had heard the noise many a time, most of all on winter nights and before storms, and folks did say it was the old lord playing on the great organ in the hall, just as he used to do when he was alive. But who the old lord was, or why he played, and why he played on stormy evenings in particular, she either could not or would not tell me. Well, I told you I had a brave heart, and I thought it rather pleasant to have that grand music rolling round the house, let who would be the player, for now it rose above the great gusts of wind, and wailed and triumphed, and then it fell to a softness most complete. Only it was music and tunes, so it was nonsense to call it the wind. I thought at first it might be Miss Furnivall who played, unknown to Bessie, but one day, when I was in the hall by myself, I opened the organ, and I saw that it was all broken and destroyed inside, though it looked so brave and fine. And then, though it was noonday, my flesh began to creep a little, and I shut it up and ran away pretty quickly to my own bright nursery. That winter was very cold. In the middle of October, the frosts began, and lasted many weeks. I remember one day at dinner, Miss Furnivall lifted up her sad, heavy eyes, and said to Mrs. Stark, "I'm afraid we shall have a terrible winter," in a strange kind of meaning way. But Mrs. Stark pretended not to hear, and talked very loud of something else. My little lady and I did not care for the frosts, not we. As long as it was dry, we climbed up the steep brows onto the fells and ran races in the sharp, fresh air. And once we came down by a new path that took us past the 2 old, gnarled holly trees, which grew about halfway down, by the east side of the house. But the days grew shorter and shorter, and the old lord, if it was he, played more and more stormily and sadly on the great organ. One Sunday afternoon, towards the end of November, I asked Dorothy to take charge of little Miss Rosamond when she came out of the drawing-room, for it was too cold to take her with me to church, and yet I wanted to go. Dorothy was glad enough to promise, so Bessie and I set out very briskly, though the sky hung heavy and black over the white earth, as if the night had never fully gone away, and the air, though still, was very biting and keen. "We shall have a fall of snow," said Bessie to me, and sure enough, even while we were in church, it came down thick, in great large flakes. It had stopped snowing before we came out, but it lay soft, thick and deep beneath our feet as we tramped home. Before we got to the hall, the moon rose, and I think it was lighter then, what with the moon and the white dazzling snow, than it had been when we went to church between 2 and 3 o'clock. I went to Dorothy in the kitchen to fetch Miss Rosamond and take her upstairs with me, and Dorothy told me that the ladies had kept the child with them, and that she had never come to the kitchen. So I took off my things and went to find her. But when I went into the drawing-room, there sat the 2 old ladies, very still and quiet, looking as if nothing as bright and merry as Miss Rosamond had ever been near them. Still, I thought she must be hiding from me, and had persuaded them to look as if they knew nothing about her. So I went softly peeping under that sofa and behind that chair, making believe I was sadly frightened at not finding her. "What is the matter, Hester?" said Mrs. Stark sharply. "Miss Rosamond is not here. She went away more than an hour ago to find Dorothy." My heart sank at this. I went back to Dorothy, and she and me and Bessie took lights and roamed over the great house, calling and entreating Miss Rosamond to come out of her hiding-place and not to frighten us to death in that way. But there was no answer, no sound. "Can she have gone into the east wing and hidden there?" I said at last. But Dorothy said it was not possible, for the doors were always locked. Neither she nor James had ever seen the keys. Well, I went back to the drawing-room and told Mrs. Stark we could not find her anywhere. Well a day, I began to think she never would be found, when I bethought me to look out into the great front court, all covered in snow. I was upstairs when I looked out, but it was clear moonlight. I could see quite plain 2 little footprints which might be traced from the hall door and round the corner of the east wing. I tugged open the great stiff hall door, and throwing the skirt of my gown over my head for a cloak, I ran out. I turned the east corner, and there were the little footmarks going up to the fells. It was bitter cold, so cold that the air almost took the skin off my face as I ran, crying to think how my little darling must be perished and frightened. I was in sight of the 2 gnarled holly trees when I saw a shepherd coming down the hill, bearing something in his arms. He shouted to me and asked if I had lost a bairn, and when I could not speak for crying, he bore towards me, and I saw my little Miss Rosamond lying still and white and stiff in his arms. Well, my dears, I have told you, have I not, how when Miss Rosamond and I moved to Furnival Hall, we were disturbed as winter drew close by the ghostly sound of someone playing the organ in the great hall. And I have told you, too, how Miss Rosamond went missing, and how everyone at Furnival Hall, even Miss Furnival herself, searched throughout that vast old house for my little Miss Rosamond, and how at last, though I was almost blind with tears, I saw the shepherd coming down the hillside, bearing something in his arms. He told me that he had been up the fells to gather in his sheep, and that under the holly trees he had found my little lady, stiff and cold as if she had been dead. Oh, the joy of having her in my arms once again, holding her near my own warm neck and heart, and feeling the life stealing back again into her limbs. I carried her upstairs and began undressing her by the nursery fire, and at last she opened her eyes. Then I put her into her warm bed, and she fell away into sleep, and I watched by her until morning, when she wakened bright and clear. She told me that she had fancied she would like to go to Dorothy, for both the old ladies were asleep and it was very dull in the drawing-room, and that as she was going through the west lobby, she saw the snow through the high window falling, and wanted to see it lying pretty and white on the ground. So she made her way to the great hall. But then, while she stood at the window, she saw a little girl, not as old as she was, but so pretty, she said, and this little girl beckoned me to come out, and I could not choose but go. And then this other little girl had taken her by the hand, and side by side the two had gone round the east corner. "Now you are a naughty little girl and telling stories," said I. "Indeed, Hester, I am telling you true. Indeed I am." "Don't tell me," said I, very stern. "I tracked you by your footmarks through the snow. They were only yours to be seen, and if you had had a little girl to go hand in hand with you up the hill, don't you think the footsteps would have gone along with yours?" "I can't help it, dear, dear Hester," she said, "if they did not. I never looked at her feet, but she held my hand tight in hers, and it was very, very cold. She took me up the fell path, up to the holly trees, and there I saw a lady, weeping and crying. But when she saw me, she hushed at weeping, and smiled, very proud and grand, and took me on her knee and began to lull me to sleep. And that's all, Hester, but that is true." So I thought the child was in a fever, and pretended to believe her as she went over her story, over and over again, and always the same. At last Dorothy knocked at the door with Miss Rosamond's breakfast, and she told me the old ladies wanted to speak to me. "I shall catch it," thought I to myself as I went along the north gallery. And yet it was in their charge I left her, and it's they that's to blame for letting her steal away unknown and unwatched. So I went in boldly and told my story. But when I came to the mention of the other little girl out in the snow, coaxing and tempting Miss Rosamond out and willing her up to the lady by the holly tree, Miss Furnivall threw up her old and withered arms and cried aloud, "Oh, heaven forgive! Have mercy! Hester, keep her from that child. It will lure her to her death. That evil child. Tell her it is a wicked, naughty child." And then Mrs. Stark hurried me out of the room, where indeed I was glad enough to go. But Miss Furnivall kept shrieking out, "Oh, have mercy! Wilt thou never forgive? It is many a long year ago." I was very uneasy in my mind after that. I durst never leave Miss Rosamond night or day for fear she might slip off again. Wherever she went after some fancy or other, there I followed, and all the more because I thought I could make out that Miss Furnivall was crazy, and I was afraid lest something of the same kind, which might be in the family, you know, hung over my darling. And so it happened that one afternoon, not long before Christmas Day, we were playing together on the billiard table in the great hall, and by, without our noticing, it grew dusk, and I was thinking of taking her back into the nursery when, all of a sudden, she cried out, "Look, Hester, look! There is my poor little girl out in the snow." I turned towards the long narrow windows, and there, sure enough, I saw a little girl, dressed all unfit to be outdoors such a bitter night, with a dark wound on her right shoulder, crying and beating against the window panes as if she wanted to be let in. She seemed to sob and wail till Miss Rosamond could bear it no longer and was flying to the door to open it, when, all of a sudden and close up upon us, the great organ pealed out so loud and thundering it fairly made me tremble, and all the more when I remembered that even in the stillness of that dead cold weather I had heard no sound of battering hands upon the glass, and although I had seen the phantom child wail and cry, no faintest sound had fallen upon my ears. Whether I remembered all this at the very moment, I do not know. The great organ sound had so stunned me into terror. But this I do know. I caught up Miss Rosamond before she got the hall door opened, and carried her away, kicking and screaming, into the large bright kitchen where Dorothy and Bessie were busy with their mince pies. She was sobbing as if her heart would break. "Hester won't let me open the door for my little girl to come in, and she'll die if she is out on the fells all night." The look of ghastly terror on Dorothy's face made my blood run cold. "Shut the back kitchen door fast and bolt it well," said she to Bessie. She said no more. She gave me raisins and almonds to quiet Miss Rosamond, but she sobbed about the little girl in the snow and would not touch any of the good things. I was grateful when she cried herself to sleep. Then I stole down to the kitchen and told Dorothy I had made up my mind. I would carry the child back to my father's house in Applethwaite, where if we lived humbly, at least we lived at peace. I said I had been frightened enough with the old lord's organ playing, but now that I had seen for myself this child beating and battering to get in, yet always without any sound or noise, I would stand it no longer. Dorothy told me she did not think I could take Miss Rosamond with me, for that she was my lord's ward and I had no right over her. And she asked me, would I leave this child I was so fond of just for sights and sounds that could do me no harm, and that they had all got used to in their turn? I was all in a hot, trembling passion. I said it was all very well for her to talk that knew what these sights and noises betokened, and I taunted her so that she told me all she knew at last. And then I wished I had never been told, but it only made me more afraid than ever. She said she had heard the tale from old neighbours, when folk used to come to the hall sometimes, before it got such a bad name in the countryside. The old lord was Miss Furnivall's father, Miss Grace Furnivall, for Miss Maud was the elder. Such a proud man was never seen or heard of, and his daughters were like him. No one was good enough to wed them, even though they had choice enough, for they were the great beauties of their day, as I had seen by their portraits. But, as the saying is, pride will have a fall, and these two haughty beauties fell in love with the same man, and he no better than a foreign musician whom their father had down from London every year to play music with him. For above all things, next to his pride, the old lord loved music. And by degrees this foreign gentleman got such a hold over the old lord that he had the great organ brought from Holland and built up in the hall where it now stood, and taught the old lord to play on it. But many a time when Lord Furnivall was thinking of nothing but his music, the dark foreigner was walking abroad in the woods with one of the young ladies, now Miss Maud and then Miss Grace. Miss Maud won the day and carried off the prize, such as it was, and he and she were married, all unknown to anyone. And before he made his next yearly visit, she had been confined of a little girl at a farmhouse on the moors, while her father and Miss Grace thought she was away at Doncaster races. But although she was a wife and mother, Miss Maud was not a bit softened, and grew jealous of her sister, Miss Grace, to whom her foreign husband paid a good deal of court, by way of blinding her, as he told his wife. But Miss Grace triumphed over Miss Maud, and Miss Maud grew fiercer and fiercer, both with her husband and with her sister, and the former, who could easily shake off what was disagreeable and hide himself in foreign countries, went away a month before his time, and half threatened that he would never come back again. Meanwhile, the little girl was left at the farmhouse, and her mother used to gallop wildly over the hills every week to see her. For where she loved, and where she hated. The foreign musician came again the next summer, but it was for the last time, for they led him such a life with their jealousy that he grew weary and went away, and was never heard of again. Miss Maud, who had always meant to have her marriage acknowledged when her father was dead, was left now a deserted wife whom nobody knew to have been married, with a child she dared not own, although she loved it to distraction, living with a father whom she feared and a sister whom she hated. She and Miss Grace now lived almost entirely apart, having separate rooms, the one on the west side, Miss Maud on the east, those very rooms which were now shut up. So she thought she might have her little girl with her, and no one need ever know, except those that were bound to believe it was, as she said, a cottager's child she had taken a fancy to. All this, Dorothy said, was pretty well known. What came afterwards no one knew, except Miss Grace and Mrs. Stark, who was even then her maid. But the servants supposed that Miss Maud had told her that all the time the dark foreigner had been pretending love, he was Miss Maud's own husband. The colour left Miss Grace's cheeks and lips that very day, and she was heard to say that sooner or later she would have her revenge. And Mrs. Stark was forever spying about the east rooms. One fearful night, just after the new year had come in, when the snow was lying thick and deep, there was a violent noise heard, and the old lord's voice above all, and the cries of a child, and the proud defiance of a fierce woman, the sound of a blow, dead stillness, moans and wailings dying away on the hillside. Then the old lord, who now had to walk with a crutch, summoned all his servants, and told them with terrible oaths that his daughter had disgraced herself, and that he had turned her out of doors, her and her child, and that if they ever gave her help, or food, or shelter, he prayed they might never enter heaven. And all the while Miss Grace stood by him, white and still as any stone, and when he had ended, she heaved a sigh as much as to say her work was done. The old lord died within the year, and no wonder, for on the morrow of that wild and fearful night, the shepherds, coming down the fell side, found Miss Maud sitting, all crazy and smiling under the holly trees, nursing a dead child with a terrible mark on its right shoulder. I was more frightened than ever. I wished Miss Rosamond well out of that dreadful house. Oh, how I watched her and guarded her. We bolted the doors and shut the window shutters fast an hour or more before dark, rather than leave them open 5 minutes too late. But my little lady still heard the weird child crying and moaning. One night, just after New Year's Day had come in, I heard the drawing-room bell ring 3 times, which was a signal for me. I would not leave Miss Rosamond alone, for all she was asleep, for the old lord was playing wilder than ever. So I wrapped her up and carried her down and laid her on a sofa, while I sat by the old ladies to help them unpick some stitches Miss Furnivall had done wrong. Miss Rosamond slept on sound. All at once, Miss Furnivall started up to her full height, and put up a hand as if to bid us listen. "I hear voices," said she. "I hear my father's voice." My darling wakened with a sudden start. "My little girl is crying," and she tried to get up and go to her. But I caught her up, for my flesh had begun to creep at the noises which filled our ears, voices and screams, and we no longer heard the winter wind that raged abroad. Suddenly Miss Furnivall went towards the door. I durst not be left, though my heart almost stopped beating for fear. I wrapped my darling tight in my arms and followed. In the hall the screams were louder than ever. They sounded to come from the east wing, nearer and nearer, close on the other side of the locked doors, close behind them. Then I noticed that the great chandelier seemed all alight, though the hall was dim, and that a fire was blazing in the vast hearth-place, though it gave no heat. I shuddered with terror. The east door shook, and Rosamond, struggling to get free from me, cried, "Hester, I must go. My little girl is there." I held her tight with all my strength. If I had died, my hands would have grasped her still. All at once, the east door gave way with a thundering crash, as if torn open in a violent passion, and there came into the mysterious light the figure of a tall old man with grey hair and gleaming eyes. He drove before him a stern and beautiful woman with a little child clinging to her dress. "Oh, Hester, Hester!" cried Miss Rosamond. "It's the lady below the holly trees. Hester, let me go to her. They are drawing me to them. I must go." Again she was almost convulsed by her efforts to get away, but I held her tighter and tighter till I feared I should do her a hurt, but rather that than let her go to these terrible phantoms. They passed along towards the great hall door, where the winds howled and ravened for their prey. The lady turned. I could see she defied the old man with a fierce and proud defiance. But then she quailed and threw up her arms piteously to save her child from a blow from his uplifted crutch. Just at that moment, when the old man, his hair streaming out as in the blast of a furnace, was going to strike the child, Miss Furnivall, the old woman by my side, cried out, "Oh, father, father, spare the innocent child." But just then I saw, we all saw, another phantom shape itself. The figure was very beautiful to look upon, proud, dressed in an open gown of blue satin. I had seen that figure before. It was the likeness of Miss Furnivall in her youth. And the terrible phantoms moved on, regardless of the old Miss Furnivall's wild entreaty, and the lifted crutch fell on the shoulder of the little child, and the younger sister looked on, stony and deadly serene. But at that moment the dim light and the fire that gave no heat went out of themselves, and old Miss Furnivall lay at our feet, stricken down by the palsy, death-stricken. She was carried to her bed that night, never to rise again. She lay with her face to the wall, muttering low, "Alas, what is done in youth can never be undone in age."
That was The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. It was read by Valerie Windsor and produced by Kay Patrick.